All right, this is not your typical conversation about LSD. You're probably used to hearing, about how Albert Hoffman synthesized it and had the bike ride and the counterculture movement and be careful around it. That's sort of typical shtick. But I purposely wanted to do a deep dive because I still, to this day, I feel like LSD, and I'm going to keep thumping this drum. I don't care. It's going to be annoying, but I feel like LSD is simultaneously both underrepresented within the media and misrepresented as well too sometimes. And I think it's underrepresented both within like traditional media and with the new rise of all the independent media platforms and podcasts and influencers and thought leaders and whoever the fuck else. Like I think there is almost somewhat systematically this like kind of sort of reason why LSD is being suppressed as well. And I think it's interesting because I think LSD has had more of an impact on American culture than psilocybin mushrooms or honestly any of the other psychedelics combined. Yet we're not talking about it for some reason, and we're not talking about it at depth. I don't believe either. It's very much the surface level story that everyone knows and passes on, but there's a lot more to LSD than you have been told, I believe. So that's what this podcast is. I brought on my homie James, who's also a fellow acid head. He facilitates psychedelic experiences for people in Colorado. He's been on the podcast a couple times. He's a great dude, but he's also, like I said, a fellow acid head. He's bundled out, and he gets it. There's a brotherhood to it. There's somewhat of this like American spirit to it. So yeah, we dive into all that here within this episode. I really hope that you enjoy it. If you'd like to go check out James' stuff, I'll leave all of his info website down in the description and the show notes of this episode. And if you haven't already, you should go check out our company, Minnesota Nice Ethnobotanicals. We are going to be transitioning into the new brand name Amantara here soon. So if you're watching this or listening to this at a later date, we might be known as Amantara. But yeah, we sell like 30 plus legal psychoactive plant medicines on our website, all with great ethical sourcing, infused with love. And so yeah, go check us out and use the code Amanita Ninja, all caps, one word, for 10% off of your order. Enjoy the episode. I hope that you learned lots of interesting things about LSD. I feel like in the process of preparing and having this conversation with James, I learned a little bit more about LSD. So that was nice because this compound, this drug has given me so much, and so this is like just a small way in which I can give a little bit back to it, hopefully, So yeah, peace out, much love. Awesome, dude. Let's talk about LSD. Let's do it. Did you take it? Did you happen to take any LSD today?
I didn't take any LSD today.
I didn't either.
Quite the taxing thing, but it's on my mind, and I think from all the LSD experiences I have, I don't think it ever leaves me at this point.
Well, that's I part of the reason like I asked you that, I honestly just said it kind of jokingly, just like to mess with you, but also like somewhat curious because that's something people would do sometimes in the spirit of doing something like this, right? Like I'm going to get in the spirit of the medicine before I talk on behalf of the medicine or whatever it is. But like, how do you feel about LSD microdosing? Or I mean, like, there's a whole very complex industry and phenomenon and research going into the microdosing, thing in general. But in particular, what do you think about microdosing with LSD? Because I haven't been subjectively, I've never been a huge fan of it myself. I enjoy what I would call mini doses or like half doses in nature sometimes on like a long trail hike with a buddy or something. But even then I'm like, I should have taken a little bit more, What do you think about the microdosing stuff, man?
So I think microdosing with LSD is really tricky because I think it can be helpful to take a real microdose, but I feel like there's a threshold where like you could take, if you take maybe like 15 micrograms, it feels like you took a little bit too much. And then there's more body load without all the heavy, beautiful effects that come along with it. So I'm more likely to take a big dose, or if I can really make sure that the microdose is too small, is really in that small range, I will take it. But I found it's way too easy for me to take a little bit more than a micro, and I don't feel comfortable in that spot. So I find it can be really helpful as long as you really know that you're like under 10 micrograms, like 5 to 10 can be like a really functional, uplifting, heart opening space for people. But like for me, I do find it's a tricky one to microdose with, whereas like psilocybin tends to be a little bit more predictable. And if you can use lab grade psilocin, you can really narrow down your predictability there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I've actually found, like you just said, it feels like it's not, I don't have lab grade psilocin. I never have. But at one point in time, I did have a good amount of synthetic 4-ACO DMT, which is like the prodrug to psilocin, essentially. And I really liked, and I could get a good dialed in sort of like, once again, what I would refer to as more of like a mini dose where I'm slightly brushing up against perception, but they were really low doses. I really did enjoy that. But yeah, LSD does have a bit of this unpredictability. And I would say too, with LSD, part of this is it does seem to have in the preparation of this, and this is something that I've heard before, but I didn't dive too much into the mechanisms. I hadn't looked too much into it, but it does have distinctly different slightly different pharmacological action than basically the rest of any other psychedelics, because it has this what's called an ergoline sort of base to it, whereas most other psychedelics either have like a tryptamine base or they have a phenethylamine base, like so the 2Cs, mescaline, things like that. But it has an ergoline base, and it uniquely, in this sort of like shotgun formula way, interacts with a bunch of our different dopamine receptors. It has this unique effect on dopamine. And so like I can see how I think, I try and break these things down like materialistically like that, but overall I think these medicines are spirits, and so like ultimately I think like the microdosing with LSD, that spirit is a little bit trickier than the psilocybin spirit, but it looks like pharmacologically, materialistically speaking, there might be some sort of like explanations that we can point to as well too. What do you think about it in terms of like, kind of like everything I just alluded to, the pharmacological action in terms of like the microdosing phenomenon with it, and just, I guess, the pharmacological action in terms of like the applicational use of LSD in general? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but
yeah, no, it's a really good question, because I feel like you hit along a lot of the points, and like the thing that I'd like to talk about that kind of is what makes LSD special in a molecular format is that it is a really funny shaped molecule. And when it enters, because it wants to enter the serotonin 5-HT2 receptor site. And so when it does that, it's got a unique shape, so it gets stuck in like a puzzle piece, but then there are like these little pieces that stick out. And when those little pieces stick out, those are the ones that tickle dopamine, and they tickle upon norepinephrine. So depending on how well they're seeded into your serotonin receptor site, depends on whether you have more of those dopamine effects or not. And that's also why the duration of LSD is so much longer, because LSD's chemical half-life is really 2 to 3 hours. But the reason that it lasts for 10 to 12 is that it actually fits into your serotonin 5-HT2A receptor site even better than a serotonin molecule. It's actually how we discovered serotonin in the first place. We actually discovered LSD first, and then chemists were looking around and trying to figure this thing out, and they realized what serotonin was after that. So it's a really unique discovery. And then like when you talk about the spiritual aspect of it, like, is there something special inside of this LSD that is like giving us this extra awakening? And that's something that, you can really speak to from experience, but it's hard to put your finger on from the pharmacology.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can't exactly be known. We can do our best, and I'm sure we're going to articulate it, but it's like a brotherhood. It's almost like the DMT breakthrough experience, truly puddling out and having a really large dose LSD experience. There's like a brotherhood in it. There's like, oh, you've been there too. And it's unique to LSD, the really, really high dose experiences. And so like whenever you were talking about the sort of receptor site activity, this sort of like dopaminergic and norepinephrine activity, how would you say, based on your subjective personal experiences with it, you've had a lot of LSD experiences, but you've also had a lot of experiences with other medicines as well too, so you have somewhat of something to base it off of. How would you say you feel like this plays out experientially? And then also, because you kind of work with people in this space and facilitate, and you help people integrate, and you offer some of these different services, and you've truly entrenched yourself in it, and you're certified. How would you say that kind of plays into the ceremonial space as well too, based on what happens experientially with LSD that makes it unique?
So LSD has a lot of unique characteristics about it, but the thing that I primarily find that makes it more unique and special than working with other medicines in the ceremonial space is that after you come through the initial 2 to 3 hours, which is like that chemical half-life kind of come up time, it tends to be a very clear-headed space, even though you're very much awakened and imbibed into the environment. It gives you a much better ability to integrate what's coming up for you. So I found that LSD compared to psilocybin is a much more integratable experience because the lessons are much more clear. And I think that could be related to some of that dopamine, norepinephrine activity, which is giving you a slight stimulating effect. So it's like taking a psychedelic and having a little bit of taste of Adderall. So you're able to dial into the experience more deeply than you would be able to dial into on just say a psilocybin experience alone. So I find that is really part of the unique factor with LSD. And then the time window is that if you're really trying to work on something in your life, it's giving you a longer time window in an operating functional space. Because I find after the first 2 to 3 hours, then you're in this functional, 7, 8 hours of functional, integratable, understandable space. And I think that's what makes the medicine special. It's also what can make it a little tricky. So it's something that I reserve for people that maybe have some other psychedelic experiences first, or they're really dedicated to trying to get something out of this experience, because at that 12-hour mark, it becomes pretty taxing for people, but they've integrated so much that they're ready to go into that integration stage and really learn from what they've gotten out of their experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I whenever I was formulating this question and diving into this and knew I was going to ask you about, I was kind of thinking about for myself, ceremonially in this context, what has it provided, and sort of been different for me. I feel so one thing that I found within my deep dive of this was, and it shares a lot of similarities with other serotonergic psychedelics in terms of its effects on hormones, even though it looks like there is some slight differences that have, need to be replicated and stuff like that. But there is this really interesting overall effect on the hormones, right? And one of them in particular is cortisol. And you described this sort of initial period, right? The first few hours, that's it's almost like the make it or break it period. It feels like for a lot of people on an LSD trip, it's all right, we're either going to hit the breakthrough and the aha and fall into that place, or it's we're going to kind of be stuck in this tension for the rest of it. It does seem and that's not a blanket statement, but there is a phenomenon to this, the LSD come up. It's very important. I think there's a lot of factors that influence it and can kind of shape it. But after doing this research, I was okay, I definitely think that the hormonal aspect of this has something to do with this come up feel. If there is this increase in cortisol that they can show, right? And that doesn't always necessarily translate into more stress, right? Sometimes there can be this quote unquote increase in cortisol and increase in stress that's actually positive. It's this, what they call eustress. It's this diving into, it looked like a very scientific way that they were explaining a purge, essentially. You know what I'm saying? You get this window where it's heightened stress, but in a safe way. And it's also paired with other pharmacological action that makes it looks kind of blunts off some of this cortisol. You know what I'm saying? It's putting you into the stress, but then evening it out. So this mirrors experientially what I felt from the LSD experience. And a lot of other psychedelics do share the same phenomena of the come up, but I truly think that the come up is a little bit sharper with LSD most of the time, especially, sort of in the larger doses. And something that I found LSD has served me very uniquely for, that is differed than other psychedelics and within my own personal path, has been, and it's been just on these 2 occasions, but it has rapidly took me out of within a day like rapidly took me out of two pretty bad addictions. The first one that it took me out of was when I was a younger man, around 19 years old, and it took me out of a pretty bad dissociative addiction, like instantly. And I took this really large dose of LSD. It was 13 hits. It was, I was in agony for essentially like a whole day. It was a very bad experience, but it was very reflective, very insightful. And then about a year ago, I had this really large LSD experience where I took 10 hits and I stopped drinking coffee. I had been a lifelong drinker of coffee and I stopped drinking it that day. I felt it. I realized, had this full realization that a lot of the underlying anxiety that I had been working on through various means with psychedelics and meditation and whatever it was like, oh, it's like a big part of this is the fucking caffeine, and you know it, dude. And within a day, I quit it cold turkey the next day. And it sounds like a made up story when I've told other people, but I didn't experience withdrawals, like almost any withdrawals. There was a little bit of fatigue, but not the splitting headaches. I wasn't craving it super hard. I truly felt like I had done this weird reboot to my brain. And I feel like I've attempted this with other psychedelics like psilocybin and things like that. But on these two occasions, LSD has been the one that's provided me with this really radical shift where it was kind of like you said. I think part of it was the long duration. I was able to, in like real time, see it all, digest it all, and then integrate it before the trip had like ever even ended. And then another aspect of this second sort of LSD experience that I had, where I quit coffee, was that I did it for several days in a row. And now this is a very touchy area of LSD that I want to try to articulate properly here. But like, I do think there's something to this. So within certain cultures, and I'm primarily thinking of like something like ayahuasca, but I'm sure this has been replicated in other places. There is an art form to dosing on consecutive days, and this sort of like peeling of the onion layers. And I do think it has to be done very carefully and intentionally with reverence and respect, you know what I'm saying? But I do believe because of LSD's sort of potency and accessibility, it offers a similar potentiality. And that was actually what I did, where I was able to break this coffee addiction. I went in with a low dose on the first day. And the second day I took a really, really large dose. And it was like this kind of like I said, peeling of the onion layers. So, yeah, I know I just threw a lot at you, but sort of like, what do you think about that concept of LSD, the multi-day sort of dosing? And also, have you noticed the similar trend with like addiction or anything particularly fascinating with its therapeutic potential about LSD?
I think it does have a unique way of unpacking things for people, and that can come apart in a lot of different ways. And a lot of times, I think it really works well with behavioral addictions, ones that are not as strongly pharmacologically attached, but like are more mental. But there's definitely a pharmacology to it, like caffeine, for example. Like the addiction to caffeine primarily is a mental thing because it's something we get so used to. There are some physical aspects of it, like some people experience headaches and things, but it's more of the psychological drive that people get so used to using it for a certain thing, and LSD can help you break through that. When you use LSD multiple days in a row, that can become an interesting factor because you do rapidly build up a tolerance to it. So it certainly can be used, but it does require larger and larger dosing to do it day after day. And most people, the limiting factor on that is that they don't have access to enough LSD to continue that on. So from the scientific standpoint, if you take one dose of LSD one day, in order to have the same experience the next day, you need to have approximately 7 doses of LSD. So it's a little tricky to do it day in and day out, but there have been really famous people like Ram Dass. He went upon a retreat where they took LSD, 400 micrograms every 4 hours for an entire month. So what they were trying to do was figure out what that potential of LSD space could be, and they found it, and they found really beautiful spaces that they could be in. But by the time that month was out, he wasn't even Ram Dass at that point; he was still Richard Alpert, and he just needed to find a way to continue into that headspace. So that's when he went to India and tried to got rid of all this stuff, walked around barefoot around India and found a guru because it uncracked this piece of him that he knew was inside of himself and no longer was the medicine the thing that needed to facilitate that, but it helped him move into this new space of understanding himself at a higher dimension. So LSD has a lot of potential for this kind of work. And I think if we can increase availability and, people like LSD being more available now, and then people like Willie Michael putting out the video on how to make LSD, it's going to make it a lot more accessible. And the thing with LSD that I think is a big misconception is that I don't think the real doses start until around 300 to 400 micrograms. And go back into the 60s when Owsley Stanley, like one of the original underground LSD chemists, was formulating LSD. All their doses were 300 micrograms per dose because they knew that was where that real potential lied. And I think as the quality and as the people went down over the years, I think they determined somebody came up with the idea of making doses around 100 micrograms. I don't know if they were just thinking in convenience so people could measure it out, but I think the idea was lost that the medicine really starts at 300.
Yeah. That's a interesting point about the sort of LSD timeline as well too, is that they used to be, and I agree with your sentiment that I think I would agree with you, somewhere around like 300, 400, 500 micrograms, like when you start to actually experience LSD, it almost feels like the 1 to 200 microgram level is like a half hit in a way. Do you know what I'm saying? But and also like nowadays there's this sort of issue with, okay, if the standard is 100 micrograms per, blotter, whatever it is, there's a lot of these blotters that I'm like, okay, this is like probably between 50 to 75 micrograms. And maybe that's because of just like the market and the vendor, or some of that's like shelf stability, but like truly, I think a lot of people are running around taking like 50, 75 microgram type level hits and thinking it's like 100 and 150 micrograms based on what it's marketed as, you know what I'm saying? And, I think there's a lot of that going on as well too. And I agree with you that like for the average person, right now doing this sort of like several day LSD vendor, whatever it is, it's not exactly super accessible to a lot of people. But at the same time, I think part of the reason I brought it up is because I do think it's decently accessible to enough people in a way. Like I know it does get expensive based on kind of like you were just saying, pharmacologically, you actually by like the second or third day, you're getting up into a really large number of hits. But, if you're somebody who has, say, $200, $300, $400, $500 to spare for that particular ceremony, you know what I'm saying? And you have access to somebody who has you can get enough LSD to sort of do this, you know what I'm saying? Compared to like psilocybin, it would be it would either be like you have to have like some synthetic psilocybin, even then you're taking really large doses by the second or third day, or like trying to do that with like actual mushrooms itself would be like damn near impossible by the second or third day, just in terms of like the amount of material that you would actually sort of have to ingest. But like a lot of this that question, I think, revolves around that sort of like accessibility aspect of LSD. And this is a really fascinating part of the conversation that I kind of want to talk to you about is, I guess, the current market for it overall. And like in this day and age, it exists both at weirdly enough, it exists both at the black market level and the gray market level and the even above market level in some very, small pockets and things like that. But yeah, could you give us maybe like a quick brief rundown on the history of the black market of LSD, and then like you and I can kind of start to like individually dive into some of these different little sectors of it.
Yeah, so it really goes back to the early 1960s. So in the late 1950s, there was a lot of research happening with LSD, and so LSD was getting out into the research world. So there were people like Ken Kesey, who was famous for writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and also famous for driving the Further bus across the United States and giving people LSD. He was initially in one of the studies with the government, and he worked at this hospital as a mental health tech. And he went in, after he was in the study, he went in and broke into the locked room, and he stole all their LSD from the hospital. So then he started giving LSD to his friends, and his friends were like, wow, this is really cool. And then there happened to be this guy, Owsley Stanley, who ends up being the guy that backs all the money for the Grateful Dead in the end. But he found a way to, he went into the Stanford library and he read all the books. He started out by actually making some methamphetamine so he could get the money together to get all the equipment to make LSD, because LSD requires a pretty hefty amount of the lab equipment. So he did that. He met somebody at the library that also helped him, and they went and they made the first batch of really high quality LSD. And the first batch that they made, the smallest amount you can make is 10 grams of LSD. So 10 grams of LSD, once you have that, what are you going to do with 10 grams of LSD? It's like the order of like 100,000 doses. So they decided that they were going to throw the acid tests. So they were like these big parties in California. They charge everybody $1 at the door, and they give you a cup of Kool-Aid, and the cup of Kool-Aid had an ungodly amount of LSD in it. And they would just give out these Kool-Aid to everybody coming in, and then this is how the Grateful Dead started. They weren't even really a band yet. They were like a bunch of guys hanging out, and they like invited them, and they were all on LSD. Sometimes they play songs, sometimes they wouldn't. So like this was like part of even maybe like what started like the idea of getting together and doing LSD in festivals. And at that same time when this was occurring, there was also this group of stick-up guys, and they would go around and rob people and take their stuff. They just at gunpoint. And these guys, they went to, in the Hollywood Hills, they heard about some guy that had LSD, like a rich like movie producer guy, and they went and they robbed him, and they just stole his LSD. They didn't hurt anybody, but they went in there and they stole his LSD. And when they did that, they all came back and they took like 1,000, 2,000 microgram big doses, and then they at the end of that night when they took the LSD, they threw all their guns away. And then they decided that they wanted to do things that were good to change the world. So at that point, they got connected with this other LSD background with Owsley. And then because they were already smugglers, because they were criminals, and they were smuggling hashish from the Middle East in surfboards back and forth to the West Coast. So they had some of this idea about how to move drugs. And then this moved on after Owsley got busted, because it was 1967. California was the first to ban LSD, it was 65 to 67 in there. California was the first state to ban LSD, but it was still legal in the United States. So they had a lab in Colorado where they were making some of it, but Owsley's tableting facility got busted. So he went to jail, and there were these two other chemists, Nick Sand and Tim Scully, and they were the chemists that created Orange Sunshine. And Orange Sunshine was the late 60s, early 70s. It was the best high-quality LSD that made it all around the world, and they were making kilo quantities at that time. So this is really when LSD started to go global and underground. So what they would do is they would stuff the surfboards with LSD and send them to India, and they would go and get Nepalese hash. They leave the LSD over in Goa in India, sell it, that got sold there, and now the hash came back in the surfboards. So that's what started the international LSD trade. And at the same time, this is part of what the government doesn't like about LSD, is that they had also sent a lot of it to Vietnam to influence the soldiers to not listen to the government and make them kill people and do things. So there was like a lot of subjugation going on in the background, but like that was like the basis of what started that underground LSD trade. It really started Owsley making the first good batch. There were a few people making batches around, but there's a last step in the synthesis of LSD where you have to put it through gas chromatography, where you only come up with a 50% pure product because half of it would be more LSD. So Owsley was the first person to figure this out, and then he passed that knowledge on to Tim Scully and Nick Sand, and that really is what set off the LSD underground. There were only a few other people up until recently that really were making the LSD in the underground. William Picard was another really big LSD producer, and he got busted in the missile silo in Kansas back in 2000, and he spent 20-something years in prison, and then he got out during COVID for compassionate release, and I actually got to meet him at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver this year. It was really cool, full circle, to see how this medicine has changed so many people's lives, and then how it also hurt people because of the way that the government has prohibited it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the entire story has been this like explosive way. You want to say that's always in this, and that's like the thing that I think a lot of people like. LSD, I would argue that LSD, and there was that interesting article that I sent over to you that I'll link in the description of this video as well too, that definitely influenced a lot of my thought on this. But I would argue that LSD had more influence on our American culture than any other psychedelic. And I think still to this day, you know what I'm saying? Like, I know there's this huge, massive media push around psilocybin. I think psilocybin is its own beautiful medicine in its own way, but it's a different medicine. Do you know what I'm saying? That's had a sort of different impact. And like, whenever I look at the explosive nature that was the LSD black market underground, and still is, it's so fascinating to me. I think part of it because of like I'm a business guy and I work in business, and I just think like the economy and market of things is really interesting. But then also at one point I was also involved within the black market of LSD myself as well too. And like, it is such a true way to potentially be able to turn people on, like, because if you have, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of things, especially in this day and age, that have to come together, an interesting alchemization of things. But if you have a small team that has the right resources, they can fucking turn on the world. Like, they can produce millions and millions of doses. You know what I'm saying? Have you ever heard of the hippie trail?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the hippie trail is actually what those guys, that group of guys that were the stick-up guys, they were known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And they were actually, because of their hash trade to India, that really is what turned on that whole hippie trail onto LSD. So the hippie trail was really like people from England and Europe that went across the Middle East into India, and a lot of them really got and settled into Goa. And eventually that's what made Goa trance, and that's where psytrance comes from, is that they would have these beach parties and LSD was there, and this new creative forms of music came out of that. But it really all stems from these guys, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and they're making the LSD in kilo quantities, and they just needed to find a way to move it, because once you have that much LSD, that's just, you have millions and millions of doses. And up until, guys like Nick Sand got busted in the early like he passed away a couple of years ago, and Leonard Picard, Leonard Picard was making 1 million doses of, 1 kilo of LSD every 5 weeks for years. And they would move the lab every year or so across the country to different spots so it wouldn't get too hot. But at that point, you just have so much LSD and so much money to move around. And I think that's all was it's kind of part of the upswing and downfall of the LSD underground, and is the money, as the government is kind of following the money around and they want to get a piece of that. I don't think they were so much caring about taking care of people as much as there was a lot of money on the underground that they wanted to have their hands on.
Yeah, and when it becomes something that, first of all, you can't control the sort of means of production or distribution, because I alluded to a minute earlier, as long as you have a few people who are resourceful and caring enough, they can turn on the fucking world and decentralize it from you. As long as there's that aspect to LSD, and also there's not the same sort of route to pharmaceuticalization, you know what I'm saying, in terms of finding a patentable thing that's better than LSD. It doesn't look like there really is, and that's another aspect of all this, man, is given everything we've talked about so far that we know in our hearts, the efficacy, the unique therapeutic potential of LSD, the deep, important impact that it's had on our culture. Yet in this day and age right now, it feels like within the current media space, not just traditional media, but even the psychedelic, fringy, independent media, even these guys aren't fucking talking about LSD enough. I swear, a lot of the conversation revolves around psilocybin. And like I said a minute ago, I think it has its own place. Very beautiful medicine that has a special place in my heart. I have it tattooed on my neck, but
I got the mushroom right here.
Hey, heck yeah, that's beautiful. I actually almost bought a necklace just like that at Lightning in a Bottle. Is it amberfi, the little mushroom that's
yeah, it's cured in I think it's a tree sap that they cure it
in. Yeah, very cool. But I think that right now there's truly a sort of underrepresentation of LSD within the media. There's also a lacking of sort of actual funding and research into, I think, LSD, because there's so much research going into both MDMA, psilocybin, and even ketamine. And that's a part of it, right? Is that sometimes people will make the argument that because psilocybin or like ayahuasca or ibogaine are natural, or organic, that they're potentially better. And I don't always agree with that line of thinking. And, you know, if you look at the amount of research and money that we're willing to put into ketamine, it's like, okay, we're not necessarily against synthetics. It's like I alluded to a minute ago. It's the overall incentive structure. That's why people are not putting as much time and attention into LSD, is because there's not the same, it doesn't fit into the capitalistic model in the same way with rapid, crazy, sort of like projections of profit that you can map out, unless you're going to go head on into the underground and become a fucking clandestine chemist yourself. But yeah, dude, what do you think about this sort of like under or representation of LSD within the media space and stuff?
So there are definitely multiple factors, and I think when it comes down to like studying it in pharmacology and understanding like what we move from there, there's like a few points. So LSD, it's open source. So if you use LSD itself, you can't patent it. It's out of the box. So anybody that's doing any research on LSD is actually doing research on analogs, which we all know about from the gray market, but they've come up with their own versions of analogs to use. But I think some of it is that it's long duration. So like if you're going to do clinical testing, it costs a lot more to do clinical tests on clients that are going to be in that space for that much longer. So that's part of it. And then a lot of it has to do with like there was so much scare in the 1960s about LSD that scare tactic has never really left the media. So the media is still aware of this, like you take 7 hits of acid and you're going to turn into an orange juice glass. And this kind of ridiculous rhetoric is still out there. And I think something like ketamine has really taken like this big role because it's legal. It was an anesthetic for many years. And there are many doctors that can just prescribe it and they don't need any specialty training. So that has led into like ketamine, almost ketamine like tourism. They're just like not really doing psychedelic work with preparation and integration. They're just bringing people in, giving them ketamine, and they have a rapid response to it. And the only reason they even got to that point is that they discovered by accident, like when they have people who had depression and say they like dislocated their shoulder. They come into the emergency room, they give them ketamine to relocate their shoulder, and then their depression would fade. So like that's how ketamine got into this antidepressant kind of category. And then everybody who's ever taken a dose of ketamine knows it's pretty far out. So they were like, oh, we're going to make this like psychedelic therapy with it. But I'd say more than 75% of ketamine providers today are operating from the medical model where you come in and they give you the drugs and they're not really supporting you in the way that I would support a client with. But there are people that do it the right way, and I know plenty of good people, and I'm trained to do it that way, is that we do a full preparation session just like any other psychedelic. We spend the time in that medicine session with you, and we help you integrate when it comes out the other side and continue to do integration therapy. So ketamine can be useful for that, but it requires a different approach. When we come back around to LSD, I think that's just between the amount of time it takes for the drug to wear off and that it's not patentable the way that it is, it's just really put some roadblocks in there. And then when you take in something like psilocybin is like decentralized in the way that anybody who can make it through middle school science can grow mushrooms. So it really has allowed more people to get into that space. And I think it's easier to convince people to take something that's natural per se than to take a lab chemical. But in my opinion, that doesn't necessarily make anything better, because I believe that everything of this planet is of this planet. And if mushrooms biosynthesize psilocybin and people make LSD out of ergot, I think it's just another animal or something on this planet creating a new drug to be used. So I think from a spiritual aspect, that's where I come from. But there are lots of other people that come to it like if it doesn't grow on the earth and then it's not good. But I don't find that that's necessarily the most useful approach. I think the most useful approach is to go about taking medicines that are pure, clean, and have a good intention going into making the medicine, so that you're getting that good intentions coming out the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess like sort of like my argument with that as well too would be like, okay, there's this current sort of model that a lot of people can get behind of like we're taking sort of nature's intelligence, psilocybin, right? This really incredible sort of miracle of nature. And through our own modern resources and understanding of reality, we're looking to potentially optimize it via analogs or whatever it is, right? You know, and so people can get like behind that relatively easy, but like to me, that's sort of like what we've already done with LSD in the way that like, you know, I think sometimes there's this misconception, and LSD is a very new invention to this world, you know what I'm saying? But it's also not in the way in terms of its ergoline base that I was mentioning earlier. Like this, it stems from LSA, this compound that it exists throughout nature in a variety of means that it looks like, and archaeological data would point towards this. Religious texts might hint towards this. Like, looks like human beings have been using LSA through a variety of means for potentially thousands and thousands of years. So it has a similar sort of backlog within the human Akashic record, like psilocybin does. This like sort of long-standing interfacing with it, you know. And LSD is this different thing. It is definitely different than the LSA experience, but it has a very similar spirit and definitely has that base to it. You could feel it. But yeah, it's something that it's an area of research that I've always like dove really heavily into is this sort of like historic use of LSA, right? And there's a lot of like interesting theories around that and just outright evidence as well too. Chalices that they've dug up where they've actually found like, okay, it has like skull cap and LSA and Datura, you know, it's like, but there's also interesting theories of sort of like Jesus himself using LSA. And there's a lot of discrepancies around that. But my thing is with all of these things, right? We argue about like Soma, we argue about the particular sacraments and what they were, and it has to be this or that. No, it was this. But I believe these people likely were similar to sort of like how we are today, where it's a conglomeration of like what's available to them and like what I mean, you know, like they're probably like combining LSA sometimes with psilocybin while being like in a dark cave and like sweating themselves out, you know, like it was probably a combination of things based on the matrix of like influence and religion and all culture and gurus available at the time and knowledge available at the time. And so like someone like Jesus, there's a lot of theories about him potentially using psilocybin, potentially using Amanita, being a sort of Tibetan guru. There's theories about him using LSA. Whenever I hear all this, and I'm like, well, all of y'all seem to have some evidence of these different things. I'm like, why not? Why wasn't he doing all this shit? Like, he probably was. If he was a true psychonaut, right? He probably fucking was. But yeah, have you ever tried LSA, man? And like, what do you think about the sort of like historical context of that, and related to like LSD, too?
Yeah, no, I have experimented with LSA. Hawaiian baby wood rose seeds have a lot of LSA in them. I find that experience on its own has a lot of body load and doesn't have the visual awakening clarities that LSD has. But I'm not convinced that in the past they may have had some way of converting the LSA, not completely to LSD, but maybe they had a way of mitigating it so that you didn't have those other effects. And like when you go back to ancient Greece, and LSA has been used in lots of cultures. I don't want to say that the Europeans or Greeks had their lock on it, but if you go back to ancient Greece, they had a thing called the Eleusinian mysteries, and there's a mystery cult that happened every year for thousands of years up and through Jesus' time. So he was definitely around in this time, and they had an Ergot wine, and this wine process, like they had different additives and admixtures to this wine, and I'm not convinced that they didn't have a way to make it more like LSD. So I feel that they've been using these and having these experiences, and they've been able to trace the LSA in there, but I'm still not convinced that it wasn't somewhat modified by their winemaking process. And so every year in Greece, it was a pilgrimage where people that were studying for this mystery would come in and they'd get this drink called the kaikion, which I believe was an ergot wine. And then they consumed that, and they would go through these rituals every year. And I think that really lends more to the experiences that we have with LSD compared to the experiences that I've had with LSA, because I find that the LSA is really challenging, has a heavy body load. and particularly too, like if you take ergot, and there were a lot of ergot poisonings would happen in Europe when rye grains would get, if the season was too wet, the ergot would grow too much on the rye grains, and then people would get this ergotism, and then it would cause hallucinations, but it also causes vasoconstriction, so people would like get gangrene in their limbs and they could die from it. So ergot and LSA on its own in high doses can be dangerous because of this vasoconstriction. And that's why I really believe that they must have had a way to make it less dangerous, because these people for thousands of years would do this ritual. So I believe that they just had a technology that we lost and passed on. Like our lineages, I mean, when the libraries of Alexandria were burned, we were probably set back 2,000 years in all the knowledge that we had. So we may have been able to keep that knowledge if those libraries weren't burned. And like cultures like in the Amazon with ayahuasca, they continued to pass their technology from generation to generation. So their generational knowledge wasn't lost in the way that ours was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then there is a very real aspect to a lot of these different cultures that have persisted in medicine cultures of it's not just the medicine, there's a technology built around it. And sometimes that's the singing and the chanting. With ayahuasca in particular, it's like literally like this bizarre, like, how did y'all know you had to combine these two? And they're like, the plants told us. That's the answer. Is the plants told us. And we're like, okay, and I believe them. I think the spirits probably did, like statistically speaking, something had to have, you know what I'm saying? Almost definitely. But yeah, that kind of was what my mind was going to when you were referring to, maybe there was a sort of technology involved with this LSA that we don't fully understand. And kind of like I said a minute ago, a lot of these archaeological findings where they have like, been able to like, date this and find the material within it. It's usually not just LSA involved with it, but there is like a real technology that has persisted with, say, ayahuasca. Another one that has persisted that I can think of is, believe it or not, actually Amanita muscaria. There's like little pockets within like the Eastern Europe, Russia area villages, more indigenous type people that over the course of centuries have had a long understanding of how you actually properly prepare and utilize that medicine. And it's very particular. It's not something like, unless you have the internet, you would just be able to like guess yourself. It's like this would have to be passed on to you for you to understand how to use this. So yeah, it would make sense that something would, and like if you were an ancient person, say ancient, person lived a long time ago, and say like Morning Glories or Hawaiian Baby Wood Rose or Ergot in some way, this LSA compound was available to you that you saw a lot of potential in, but then also saw a downside. That's where like your alchemy would come into play, and you could be a true alchemist and you would see the opportunity. I don't know if they had entrepreneurs back then. I think they always have, but they would see that and they'd be like, look, if I can figure out how to mitigate the nausea involved with this, we do this as modern day psychonauts all the time. And if you go to like forums and you're like, shrooms make me nauseous, you'll have 30 dudes tell you how to mitigate that. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. And it also, the phenomenon of ergotism is really interesting because it looks like it's something that's been around for a very long time. It's a very real part of human history that we don't deal with as much today. But it was essentially kind of like you're alluding to when under the right sort of like environmental conditions, certain crops, especially rye, because a lot of like places would rely on rye in order to make bread, and sometimes different like alcohol and things like that, but it could get like infested with this ergot fungus that would both cause the sort of LSA like sort of experience and visions and insight, but it would also simultaneously cause a lot of like bad physiological unhealthy things as well too. And there was these really bizarre cases. There's lots of them. If you just like Google like crazy cases, historical cases of ergotism, there was one, it's like the 1500s in Rome
where these people dance to death, like hundreds of people dance to death. And then there's debates about what exactly led to it, but a lot of the consensus is they think that at least ergotism had at least a part to play in that. And it lined up with certain, like I said, with environmental factors and things like that would lead to this particular sort of like fungus and outbreak of it. But people just got down. They just freaking danced until their feet bled and they died within the streets of Rome, hundreds of people. And then, like there's like the Salem witch trials, of course, that become like very like, oh Jesus, were we hanging a bunch of LSD fairy chicks, festival chicks in the 17th? Yeah, like it looks like we were 1600s, but there was another really interesting one that I read that I think you'll get a kick out of. There was this army. It was the Russo-Turkish War in the 1700s. There was this army that was going. They were trying to go like through this part of the Caspian Sea or something like that, but they were on this big push within this war. It was like a very definitive moment within the war. They were making a very large-scale aggressive push, and the soldiers and horses ended up consuming this bread like at mass scale that had this ergot fungus, and it completely halted and fucked up their entire push for the Russians. They had to like completely retreat, because their soldiers were just having these delirious, vivid hallucinations and awful sort of physical symptoms, and even like dying and things like that. And so it was actually something that people at a certain time in history had to consider at one point, is like this random, aggressively sickening LSD trip that could kill you. Yeah. And if you think that's interesting, I say that, right? Because if you think about, I'm just like thinking about this out loud. If this is something that's been around for a lot of human history, this phenomenon, maybe that is some way embedded itself into the collective sort of consciousness around the LSD molecule in general, and LSD in particular, because there is sometimes and I know there's different media, a lot of different aspects why it's happening right now, like we've unpacked, but maybe there is also like kind of this stored collective trauma around like the ergoline LSA, you know what I'm saying? Like headspace, in terms of, for a long time, it was like unpredictable and fucking, you didn't know when it was going to happen to you, and it killed people, and also people got hung for it. Yeah, maybe that's somewhat, transferred into our modern day, like energy around it as well too. It's a weird thought, but
no, it's not a weird thought at all. I mean, Albert Hoffman went into the experiments of trying to make LSD knowing this. This knowledge was what he knew going into it, and he knew there was potential in that. I mean, he wasn't looking for a visionary substance when he created LSD, but he was aware of all these implications that had occurred in the past. And I think this knowledge of this happening kind of coincides with when people changed from being hunters and gatherers and became farming cultures, is that's when this started to occur more. So it's been ingrained in the modern human psyche since we started farming, that like these things would have potential in them, and we didn't necessarily know how to harness them. And I think the ancient Greeks, like they looked at it too, and that's where they figured out this kykeon, this like ergot line. I think they figured out a way to break it down in a way that you could take it and have more of the psychoactive effects. So like it's really been ingrained deeply in that cultural matrix that we're like really digging into this collective consciousness where we knew there was something there, and it was something to be found. And I think that got channeled through Albert Hoffman and his experiments, and like it helped us understand where things went. And even just recently, we learned that morning glory seeds and Hawaiian baby wood rose, the reason that they have lysergic compounds is that there's actually a fungus inside of the seed, just like it's not ergot, but it's a fungus that produces
mushroom.
Yeah, it's a fungus.
Oh, I have seen that. My business partner sent that to me whenever that broke, and me and him were tripping out about it. Yeah, I can't believe I didn't even consider that for this conversation. That's a really good, interesting, relevant new news. Yeah.
The mycelium is in the planet there, and it's communicating in all sorts of ways, and that comes through in this way too.
Yeah, dude, it's and like another thing that kind of like stuck out to me within this LSD research and exploration is that So the first one originally was the Native American church that was made as a protective barrier so that Native American cultures could continue to use peyote. Then, there was complications of like the drug war. Then they quickly were like the first to kind of get exemptions. But ever since then, there's been this thriving, um, very interesting, complex spectrum to these entheogenic psychedelic churches all throughout the United States. Some of them have existed around like psilocybin and cannabis. A lot of exists around like ayahuasca and incorporating those indigenous teachings and matrices into them. You know what I'm saying? But LSD, there's not been a single LSD church, even to this day, that has gotten the same sort of levels of exemptions. And mind you, overall, there's only been a few that have actually gotten the quote unquote exemptions. And there's arguments about how valid these exemptions even are, right? But it looks like LSD has been one that in particularly has gotten quickly shot down and gotten a lot of like police heat around it quickly. And it comes back to kind of like this thing that we've been alluding to, maybe this collective consciousness and feeling around the ergot lines, but then also like the fact that it is so heavily associated with this sort of like very strong, thriving underground culture that was never killed off for the drug war. It stuck around, still is around to this day. But yeah, I just noticed that there wasn't really. Do you know anything about LSD churches? I know there's been some like famous ones that have cropped up and gone away, and I'm sure there's definitely plenty of underground LSD churches, but you don't really see a lot of these above ground LSD churches. You're starting to see quite a few psilocybin and ayahuasca churches come above ground and with or without exception say, fuck it, we're doing this. But you don't really see the same thing with LSD. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it stems from the drug war, and then the way that the churches, so the three organizations that actually have government approval are the Native American Church for peyote, and then the UDV and the Santo Daime churches for ayahuasca. The way that they're getting around it is that they are saying that their religion stems back all this time where they've been using this medicine, and then they're allowing it from a religious standpoint that it's been in existence for X amount of time, and they can, and that, so the government is allowing them to use the medicine that they've used in time and memoriam, which is kind of interesting too, because like the Native American church really didn't even start until the late 1800s using peyote as a sacrament. I mean, it's been used in other cultures and things, but that lineage of the way that they do it now really started then. So I think it may take time, but I think ultimately it comes around to that LSD is a synthetic medicine that has to be done in a clandestine way, whereas like even the people getting away with psilocybin, I mean, they can grow the mushrooms at their house and they don't have to access them through a clandestine pipeline. And I think ultimately that's what the government is keeping their eye on, is that there's no way to make sacramental LSD without really breaking a lot of laws. And I think that's kind of what is the limiting factor. And then people that are doing LSD in a religious way are they're really careful, and they're really worried that the government is going to come down on them, so they're not as public. Whereas people working with psilocybin or ayahuasca, they're natural products, and there's a lot of talk about it, so that people, even that aren't under the exemptions, they're getting more guts to be more public about it. But I think the LSD people, because of the clandestine nature of making the medicine, it's kept them really on the down low. And I mean, this goes back to like the 60s, where like Timothy Leary tried, after LSD became illegal, he tried to make the League of Spiritual Development, which was LSD, which is like a church. And there were some spin-offs from that as well, but they just got heavy persecution by the government because they're accessing medicine through a clandestine web, and then that clandestine web makes a lot of money, and ultimately the government wants their money. And I think that's a lot of what breaks down in the backgrounds of these situations. Like I always try to tell people, like, the government isn't really interested in protecting you. Like, for a great example is like Al Capone didn't go to prison for killing people. He went to prison for tax evasion. So a lot of it has to do with the money and the background of that, and then not wanting to get caught. And I think LSD has a lot of spiritual depth to it, and I've worked with a lot of people in spiritual ways with it. But to be public about it right now is too dangerous.
Yeah. And one thing I consider with all this, with LSD, at the current state of it, the current state of like taking LSD as an end consumer, as somebody right now, right, as an individual, is like not only the sort of backlog that we were talking like a minute ago, collectively of the weirdness around LSA and how that's existed historically, but then there was probably also like some good amount of like shaming and persecution involved, and it looks like there was Salem witch trials, all the Jesus, maybe, like all the things, right? But then even in this day and age, like it's like you said, if you want to access it, you are having to connect and become a node within that sort of like that network, that mycelial network. For everybody, that's not something that they want to do. And I also think this gets a little bit more into the idealistic, but it is something I consider. I think about, the energetics in a way of the thing that I'm consuming and putting into my body. And with LSD, it's unfortunate you usually don't know exactly. You don't have unless you're very connected to the original source and know that person and trust that person. Likely it's been through a lot of different people's hands, you know what I'm saying, in a lot of ways. And like, hopefully it was made with love, but like, you don't know, maybe the guy made it like angrily in his kitchen sink, like it's, but that is the thing too, though, about it. There's this, and I'm sure a lot of it comes down to just like the actual sort of, quality of synthesization itself, but I've noticed a sharp difference in the quality of LSD. Like there's some LSDs that, regardless of like dose or whatever it is, like this LSD is really good LSD. Like this is like clean LSD. Like once you've taken enough LSD, there's something very real to that, I think. Yeah, have you experienced that as well too? Like this big variability in the kind of like actual quality, not just like dosaging?
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to the chemist with the right intentions going into it. At this point, like I only work with either gel tabs or liquid LSD, which is coming more directly from the source. And I think the problem when it gets to blotter is that is usually sold out to people that buy a gram of LSD powder and then they like do it themselves and put it on the blotter. So blotters are really inconsistent. And there's the manufacturing process of LSD. That last step is so critical to making a really pure batch, and you have to be like, you need to have like basically a like almost PhD level of organic chemistry to be able to do that in a way. And I think particularly like in the 1980s, that there was like a big drop down, and I think LSD quality, a lot of it has gone back up, but there's just a disparity in how it's dosed out, and I think that's part of it. And then the intention. I just think that intention is so important. Like when I met William Leonard Picard, like he did the speech at the Psychedelic Science, and he talked about his process, and he would pray over the LSD. He would play Gregorian chants to the LSD while it was in the laboratory, and all of that intentionality is what made the LSD so good. And I think this is my only concern about like they've publicized the process of making LSD now. It's going to be made by a bunch of different people, so it could bring down the quality. Mm-hmm. I think that is going to be a risk in the next 10 to 20 years, that there might be a lot more LSD on the market that's not as high quality. And I think it's very hard to be able to find that. And if you don't have the right people and you don't know the right people to be able to get that really good stuff is really difficult. And I think that lends its way into like the conversation of some of these gray market analogs. And I think some of them even may have a higher quality than some of the clandestine LSD, because in order to make the LSD analogs, you have to have a high level of chemical knowledge in order to get to that point in the first place. So there's definitely room in that market for like things like 1P LSD or 1C. There are all these different new ones that are pro drugs for LSD, and I think having them out there and the availability of those is helping more people access good medicine.
So I would agree that like, especially this time in history with the quote unquote like psychedelic renaissance and increase in attention on like psychedelics, there is going to be more of a overall demand, I think globally, but especially within the Western space for LSD. I think that the markets are probably already seeing that. It's something that some of like the onion markets and places would reflect as well too over the past 10 years, I would say. But yeah, there is going to be a lot more demand. And because of that, people are going to want to supply. So there probably is going to be a lot more players, especially if there's that in combination with the access to information in order to be able to sort of synthesize, So it's going to be, and I think where people, well, at least what I have done or what I've learned through trial and error over a long period of time is if I find a good source, stick with that person as long as I can. If they disappear, whatever it is, or not available anymore, I heavily rely on my own network of people and being like, hey, do you have a good source? You know what I'm saying? Like, can you stand by this particular LSD? I think that's a decent, okay way of going about it. It's not perfect, but it probably is going to become more complex for consumers over the next 10, 20 years if there's a influx and an increase in just the amount of people actually making it. But I do think that the gray market is also interesting. I've actually only tried one of the analogs, LSD analogs. It was 1P LSD, which is, from my understanding, it's like pro-drug to LSD. It's almost essentially the exact same thing. It kicks in a little bit later, people say, but I found that it felt almost identical to LSD, but like you said, it felt like a very high quality LSD. It felt like I had a few batches of what was marketed as, and I can't confirm, but it was marketed as Owsley recipe LSD back in the day, and it felt extremely clean. It felt like it had the spirit to it. And the 1P that I tried was actually very similar feeling to the Owsley recipe LSD, believe it or not. But yeah, I think that the gray market both offers people sort of like safe accessibility, right? But then I wonder, like, what is there potentially, have you tried some of these other LSD analogs, and do you see a whole lot of potential in some of the other ones qualitatively, experientially?
Yeah. I find that, I've tried 1P LSD, and I agree with you. The experience is nearly identical to good LSD. However, it does take a little bit longer to kick in. But from my experience with ALAD and FLAD, which were LSD analogs created by Sasha Shulgin, wonderful guy that reintroduced MDMA to the world, his version, so that ALAD, it's got a much better visual content to it, but it's less cerebral, it's less heady. So like you can go out and experience stuff beautifully visually without getting really stuck into a head hole of it. So I thought that is unique. And then its cousin FLAD is kind of the opposite. It will put you into a really deep thought-based space, maybe a little bit less visual, but the intensity of the process is much deeper. So I think, like, if you're trying to really dig into something that's in your subconscious, that one could be a really great one. And like that ALAD is really great. Like if you want to like go to a concert or experience like being around people, but having all the visual and the beauty enhancements of LSD without necessarily getting sucked down a rabbit hole. So like there definitely are different potentials in some of these gray market LSD or LSD analogs. And some of them are just like 1P was just created as a way to bypass some of the laws to get it out there more, which I believe is a great thing too. But I think that by channeling this chemistry knowledge and adding different parts of the molecule and changing the shape of this molecule, it does have different therapeutic potentials that will have to be investigated further. Some of the clinical studies, I mean, all the clinical studies in the United States for LSD are not LSD. They're all analogs of LSD. So they all have slight differences in the way that we're studying them. So it really makes some of the data is skewed because it's kind of hard to compare their data with what's going on in the real LSD community because it's not actually LSD. It's another analog of it. So there definitely are some places to explore with this. It's just some we have to do a lot more research with, but I think they all have great potential. And then like all psychedelics, the dosing changes how they're going to impact you too. So whether you take a larger dose, it could change how these little minute differences are. And I think that everything can be achieved with regular LSD that all these analogs can go into. It probably just has to do with dosing level.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah, I've definitely read some different reports on the different analogs and stuff. I was curious about your subjective experiences with them. The ALAD thing, I'll take note of, and the FLAD. One compound that I've always really enjoyed is 2CB, and it's dose dependent, I would say, for this, but at the right dose, I can get into a similar place where it's very visual. There's this kind of uptick in energy, even empathy, but it's not too headspacey. At the right dose, if I take a large enough dose of 2C, it can definitely become both headspacey and visual and all the things. But yeah, I enjoy having it as a tool for that particular use case on, like, say, like a hike or maybe a music festival or something like that. Um, but yeah, I'll definitely take. I'm think I'm gonna try.
Yeah,
I want to experiment with Alad.
Exploring that and exploring FLAD is definitely worth it. The other thing, like I love 2CB as well, and I think the thing that makes it uniquely special is that it doesn't set you up for a tolerance for LSD or psilocybin. So if you're gonna do like a music festival, you can take like 2CB on like the first day, and then you can take LSD the next day, and it won't. There's no cross tolerance. So, and especially earlier we were talking about doing multi-day sessions. Like that is tends to be my approach. I like to do 2CB on the first day of the session, and then the next day it could be LSD, or I also really enjoy LSD and MDMA together. So starting with a 2CB day to like warm your energy into it, and then be really intentional the next day of how you use LSD and MDMA can be a very beautiful arc of the experience.
I love that, dude. That's me and Buddy were just recently talking about this. It's one of our favorite use cases for 2C is this sort of onboarding ramp. And it can either be done kind of like you just described, like, and I've done that exact thing that you just described, where it's like the first day at the festival is 2C, and then the second day I'll start dipping into some of the LSD. But I've also found it useful for same day dosing actually as well, where say I plan on taking a larger dose of psilocybin, I might take 2C and be in that space for an hour or two before I kind of dose the psilocybin as like this onboarding ramp. So yeah, 2C is really, and 2C was one of the one. It's like 2C was one of Shulgin's favorites. I think the 2C series like was like his favorite.
2CB was one of the Magic Seven. So yeah, it was definitely high up there on his list of really good medicines. I also like 2CI. It's not as widely available, but it's also a beautiful medicine too.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's what our next discussion could potentially be about, is a deep dive on 2C series overall, but 2CB too. That would be interesting. I haven't heard a whole lot of people really actually deep dive on 2C too much, and I think that it's relevant. Like, I've seen it enough. It's another one that I think is a little bit underrepresented. It looks like it has unique therapeutic potential for various reasons, but one of them in particular that looks really interesting is that people who are on antidepressants can take 2C, and because of its mechanism at the 5-HT2C receptor, serotonin receptor, they can be on these SSRIs and take 2C and actually get the full qualitative, like visionary, insightful sort of experience that comes with it. So maybe we'll do like a 2C deep dive next, if that's something you potentially be interested in, man.
It's a great medicine, and I'm a big Sasha Shulgin fan. Boy, I've read both Tikal and Pikal, and I've been very interested in his approach of breaking down the mescaline molecule and creating all these beautiful different medicines from it. And yeah, I would love to talk about that too in the future, because
amazing.
It's just like you were talking about earlier, being in an experience and like seeing the molecules, and like that is how Sasha Shulgin created 2CB, is that he was experimenting originally with mescaline, and he just like visually could see all these chemical scaffolds, and he thought about, how do I achieve that, because he's a brilliant chemist. So he ahead of time was seeing the molecules and could see that what would happen if I changed this group to this group, and then he was able to execute it in the laboratory. So that really made for so many special psychedelics that are out there today. I think the most unfortunate part is the accessibility, is that something like 2CB is much harder to get your hands on than LSD or MDMA nowadays. But I feel that if we can get the word out there a little bit better, people would love it, because I find it's probably one of the best medicines to work with as far as the duration and then the after effects. Like, I feel that once you come off of 2CB, you're such in a clean headspace that you really are not having any of these after effects that like LSD and MDMA can have. So I think that therapeutically speaking is really highly valuable, and moving into like a psychedelic therapy space, if the accessibility of 2CB goes up, it will be one of the best medicines that we'll have in psychedelic therapy.
I agree. And I would love to see the sort of accessibility of it come up, because even as someone like, I have a pretty decent network and I very much love 2C, and there's times when it's like, oh, the TC market's a little bit right now. It's in different parts of the world are different. There's different 2C markets in different parts of the world. But then another aspect of the 2C thing is you kind of have to worry sometimes about, it is one of the compounds that you do want to test and things like that, reagent tests whenever you get it. Unfortunately, there has been some tainting and stuff involved. And part of that is like the whole kind of like mysterious ecstasy black market that 2C has been somewhat unfortunately wrapped up into. But I think we should go ahead and put a pin in this for our next conversation about 2C. But yeah, man, the thing you said about Shulgin, visualizing it, mescaline, it's a trend that I've noticed in general with a lot of these people, but like a lot of these people within the mystical space, gurus, but like there's something about these clandestine chemists. I know that Shulgin wasn't necessarily like super clandestine for a long period of time, but these chemists, they a lot of times report sort of this mystical insight and relationship with the spirit world that influence their work. It is super relevant since we've just spent a whole podcast talking about LSD, but Albert Hoffman, that was something he talked about in LSD, My Problem Child, was as a child, he had these sort of like mystical experiences in the woods and stuff that he really felt this calling to sort of like reconnect with as an adult, which was like, that was one of the best parts. It might have been my favorite part of the entire book, honestly. When I was like trying to learn about that man, I was like, I feel like I understand you a little bit better, bro. Yeah,
his time in nature really influenced his understanding of his connection with the universe, and the chemical world is just an extension of that. And for these like really brilliant people like Albert Hoffman, like they were able to see that connection and put it together and come up with new medicines. And not only did he like create LSD, but he was the first one to synthesize psilocybin, because of like seeing these things as a part of nature and understanding that there is such potential locked in there, and that if we can make a medicine that's pure and solid and repeatable, people can have these experiences in a safe and effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, man, this has been an amazing conversation. Truly, I've had a blast. Is there any sort of last final thoughts that you have for people about LSD? And also, please tell people where they can find you at and stuff too, brother.
Yeah, so you can find me at frontrangepsychedelic.com. Always available to do consultations. I give my time freely. If you want to take longer sessions, we can do a long Zoom session. So please access me that way. And then my final thoughts on LSD is that I believe this medicine is one of the most powerful, life-changing medicines that we have, and deserves to be used responsibly. And moving forward into a therapeutic space, we need to find ways to make this more applicable and make it more accessible to people. So I'm available to have these conversations and help people through these spaces. There are all sorts of new things happening right now that are on the forefront, and I believe that in a therapeutic sense, they have also created a LSD antidote. So that's going to really be helpful in the therapeutic space, because we'll be able to give someone this antidote at, say, the 8-hour mark when they're like ready to wrap it up. They won't have all the tail effects from the LSD. So like that is another level of research that we're in. And I'm just looking forward to seeing how this all grows and how we can really help each other.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. I'll make sure I put all of James's information and stuff like that down in the description so that you can find him. Like I told you before we started recording this episode, this came from a place of just earnestly wanting to understand more about this molecule and spirit that I feel like has given a lot to me and to us as a collective. And whenever I had that thought and I started jotting stuff down in my Google Drive folder, I was like, who am I going to talk to about this with? Should I make it a solo cast? Like, I was like, James. It came to me so quickly. I was like, James would love, and he could just rip it. He understands LSD. I know he does. And so, yeah, it was perfect, man. It lined up perfectly, and I can't wait to have you back on and talk about the 2C stuff. It's going to be awesome.
I look forward to our next time talking together, my friend. It's always been a good experience with you, and I love your perspective from someone who's in the younger world of this that really has their hand on it. It's really important that people like you and your generation grow into this space together.
I appreciate that, brother. I really appreciate that. I think what's really, really important to me is like my network and family and tribe that I've built. And I consider you a very, very beautiful part of that. So, yeah, brother. Yeah, dude. Much love. Peace out, guys.